finish the utilitarian part of the building very quickly, but then in a way just have the rest of the building built by a crew of 12 men that would spend 20 years and that would that would really make the building out of solid concrete, classical concrete in its entirety. Well, the other option, the 40-month option, was of course to have an enormous crew and to not make the skin of the building out of actual concrete, but to make it out of chicken wire and to spray it and to apply spray concrete with it in a very accelerated and unreal process. So what was very fascinating was to see how those kind of options were beginning to influence the whole mythical quality also of a building like that. Now, the next building I want to show is the building or our project for the très grande Bibliothèque in Paris, which which will be built, in fact, in the east of Paris, on a site on the Seine, which you see here, the city and the river. Mitterrand has distributed his grand projet rather carefully in the city, but after the last one, the Grand Arche, it was felt that it was time to also do something again for the east of Paris and to make a single statement, a major statement that would work, that would rehabilitate and re-inject energy in that part of the city. Now, the project of the Très Grande Bibliothèque had everything to do with the euphoria which I just described, the euphoria about Europe, in the sense that it was not simply an enormous library, but it was an accumulation of 5 separate and identifiable libraries that all were supposed to be built on the same address or in the same place, in the same building. One was a library for all the visual images, all the video clips, but also all the movies that had been made or generated since 1945. So it was a complete cinematheque or mediatheque. The next one was a library where all the recent acquisitions in terms of books, but also all the recent acquisitions in terms of films and videos. So from the beginning, and that was very interesting about the building, word and image were stated as being equal. That was the second library. The third library was a classical library, a reference library. The fourth library was a library of all the catalogs that had ever been generated, so a catalog library. And the fifth library was a real scientific research library. So in other words, the program of each of them was very specific and very different from each other, and it was also absolutely obvious that they would be used by, that they would have very different degrees of popularity and different and a very different impact, in the sense that the Cinematheque was obviously kind of populist and the research library elitist. So all of that had to be accommodated in a single, or built in a single building on a rather beautiful but complex site. Here is the river. For those of you who know Paris, this is the Palais Omnisport, a big hall, sports hall, which is especially known because it has walls sloping grass. This is the Ministry of Finance that sticks timidly in the Seine. And here, the site that was chosen for the library is here on the other side, on an area that is mostly occupied by railway, between 2 bridges, and between here the railway lines of the Gare d'Austerlitz that will remain there. So in other words, it was supposed to be built on a fairly constrained site, with a very bizarre, typical French kind of urbanism. Namely, these were 350, this is the area of the site. The area of the site didn't touch the bridges, so it was actually not very well connected to the context of Paris. But the only connection was a formalist connection of an axis That was the access of a pedestrian bridge that entered at the center of the site and connected here with a new park that is being built here. So basically, the bridge and this kind of symmetrical axis were supposed to be enough of a kind of reference and attachment to the city of Paris. The site, as I said, is enormous, 350 meters and here 275 meters, so colossal in a way which is almost not imaginable. And also the rules for the urbanism implied very strongly a kind of flat or horizontal building, in the sense that the average height, I think, was supposed to be something like 24 meters. But there were supposed to be allowed were exceptions for exceptional reasons that could go something like 70 meters, and there was even it was even possible to generate elements of exceptional symbolic importance that could be, I think, of unlimited height. So in the beginning, we simply investigated flat versions in a kind of desperate attempt to be obedient. And basically, what the most obvious organization seemed to be, would be an enormous platform which basically contained nothing but storage, and then a series of libraries that were either coming out of this platform or descending inside it, that would be the different autonomous libraries, each articulated in their own way. But when we were doing this, we had two feelings. First, a kind of nausea against the obligation to articulate so many differences and to invent so much. And the second was a kind of programmatic panic when we imagined that the kind of total trajectory that would have to be public in a building like this was over a mile long. And that seemed to us to imply a kind of insanity or a kind of dangers, because also in the program it was written that the number of visitors were even exceeding the hordes that are daily visiting Beaubourg. So when we imagined that these hordes would have to make this circuit of a mile long, we started thinking in a different way. We also felt that in the context, with the context of the park, which was flat, the Seine that is flat, a flat building would not, be able to have sufficient impact against a beautiful skyline which is here implied, but which continues of a series of towers from the 60s and the 70s of the arrondissement just behind, which would completely overwhelm such a building. So then we started thinking in a way which was more systematic, in a sense where we began to think that this is a Seine, that we can say that in the program of the library there are three conditions. There is always offices or administration, people who tell other people who deal with the books. There's always closed storage, there's always open storage, and there's always public facilities. So we began to imagine that there could be a vertical organization of these shafts, and that as long as all of these conditions were represented, almost any section through them would be a kind of programmatic plane where whatever program was occurring could be easily organized. So then we thought that, okay, the offices are away from the Seine, then there is the closed storage, and then toward the river it opens up in a concept that we quickly began to find, again, irritating in its exploitation of the Seine as almost the only reference of something that was attractive. Here, and you will see in this whole lecture a series of shameless sketches that really document the earliest moments of this project. So then we began to think, okay, here is the offices, there's the storage block, then we only need a kind of very thin layer of vertical, basically a thin layer of elevators. And then this, all the kind of public rooms, whether open or closed, can be warped across, again, as an almost autonomous element. And as long as these elements are present, it can simply puncture any of those layers and the program can be organized. Here are the sketches. So then we started building models, and this was one of the first ones, where we imagined how, in a way, again, and this theme of Babel was definitely on our minds, where we started to imagine that the libraries themselves could be a system of kind of ramps or terraces that in a very improvised and wild and random way would climb up these sheaves of other conditions, and that could therefore acquire very different conditions every time for every library. Here you see another sketch with a kind of storage, a wall, and the different libraries. Here you see, and moments like this, kind of our self-hatred against the action of designing became very strong. This is a kind of Fakir model. Then it developed further, and then we decided that maybe the three given conditions could always be a core, and the public could form a kind of spiral around the core, kind of wrap around this tower. And it was that at that moment, and especially when we put that model kind of in the larger model, when we kind of judged what the impact was of such a kind of massive element, because it was at least 100 meters high, that we became kind of relatively convinced that in such a mass, we could only, that such a mass was a kind of solution both in terms of the craziness of the context behind and also of the kind of relative insipidness of the conditions in front. And at that moment, it became very interesting and very stimulating in a way to be working on all those schemes at the same time, because it turned out that a sketch which we had made for an earlier scheme or for a different scheme suddenly acquired an amazing appropriateness for this library, because this sketch was simply a very brutal concept which suggested, which was really only a question, which suggested if you are dealing with a large program, and if that large program is consisting of, in essence, two elements, namely very boring, repetitive and utilitarian spaces on one hand, and on the other major, public, special and unique spaces, maybe instead of this always this horrible obligation to represent the public space, these horrible obligations to invent architecture, maybe it is also possible to organize the utilitarian fields or spaces or floors in a very boring manner, kind of simply to stack them, and to not define the kind of public space as something that is built, but on the contrary, as something that is left out, or a gap or a void in those utilitarian spaces. So it was basically the question, maybe it is possible to invent a building where the most important parts of the building are not building, but absences of building. And these absences are carved out or from a mass, a solid mass of utilitarian substance, and because of the total pressure of the utilitarian substance, those voids or those holes will acquire their own qualities and their own destinies, so to speak. So once we began to think in these terms, it became almost a self-evident logic, where we thought, okay, maybe the library is this, maybe all the storage is just the kind of the floors, and whatever special condition we need, we carve it out from the floors. And it is very flexible, because if a room has to be dark, it is on the inside of the mass. If a room has to have a view, it is on the edge. If the room has to have roof light, it's on top. And if the room is visited by vast numbers of people, it's downstairs. And the only thing we had to do is, if the previous slide was a section, is to imagine a plan. And of course, even a plan was relatively easy to imagine. First of all, let's say if this was a plane of 100 by 100 meters, 300 feet, then it was sufficient to puncture that mass at regular intervals with elevator shafts, and each of the spaces could be imagined on any area on this field. And because of the regularity, and the only condition of one of those new spaces was that one or more of the elevator shafts penetrated it and thus serviced it. And then we went let's say even further and began to explore the options for space making in such an operation, because it turned out that spaces that you could never imagine as a built form were extremely feasible if you imagine them as simply absence of building. Because here we thought, well, maybe we can make a library that starts horizontally, then turns into wall, then becomes a ceiling, and then literally turns over itself and kind of makes a loop-de-loop. So then we explored these kind of potentials, and then we had a kind of difficult moment of kind of literally beginning to translate the program in these forms that were rather astonishing and very vulgar to ourselves. So that was a moment when it was difficult for us to believe. But that moment was broken when we thought, when we sketched this sketch as the first, let's say, convincing emblem of what the library could be, or at least to us very convincing. Then we started to do the same operation in a model. So this was the mass of storage, and then we deducted or subtracted the voids of the public spaces. Here we have one of the first ones. So again, you see all the storage, and those strange forms are the libraries. This is everything that is excavated, the system of libraries. And here you have the kind of leftover standing on the side. And it was especially this moment that we became extremely happy and started to believe that it was a concept with a great future and a great potential. Here we have a further diagram that kind of shows in a way the thing. So these are the libraries, and then there is a kind of system of vertical access, but we could also imagine that there were more of kind of vertical systems, air, columns, lifts, etc., etc. These are kind of further sketches of the process of development, and these are some of the early plans that also revealed a kind of amazing simplicity and flexibility of the concept, in the sense that we would always declare that everything was storage. Always the 9 elevators were given. There was also given that one edge of the plan was always offices. And then we could kind of simply carve out or draw or imagine the different spaces. This was a kind of central space. If we wanted a balcony, we could just break out to the edge. If we wanted to have more connections, we could just puncture for little elevators or big elevators. We could have escalators, etc., etc. So basically, in spite of the fact that it was a very strong form, the inside architecture could be pursued with a kind of almost complete freedom. And also the kind of notorious problem of a library, which is the relationship between the public space and the surface of the reading room and the surfaces of the open or closed storage, was very easy to resolve, in the sense that you could organize certain spaces over a series of floors, or you could reduce it, on the contrary, and I have it only on one floor. So you could, again, puncture as many or make as many connections as you wanted. The next, please. So slowly but surely we came closer to the definitive project. Then we had an interesting but difficult moment where we invited some intellectuals from the outside to test a scheme and a hypothesis that we also were not 100% sure about. So for them we made a reverse model where everything that we excavated was kind of presented as a solid. So those were the excavations, and it met with a kind of stony silence. And Another very difficult moment was to answer the question how a system like this can be supported by structure. In other words, how can you devise a structure that can support at the same time the solid and the void? And in the beginning, we had the idea that maybe we could kind of span a very deep beam, Vierendale trusses across the 100 meters, and in a system where maybe every floor could coincide with a kind of structure, so that you could have a very interesting alternation of spaces that had structure and spaces that were completely free. But over the 80 or 90 meters, that turned out to be incredibly complex and almost mathematically impossible to calculate. And also we wanted, or I wanted, and this was a very personal resistance, I wanted to do away with a kind of, again, in my view, very negative obligation, a very negative aspect of vertical buildings, namely that not only in a section like this one, the structure, the kind of depth of concrete take a certain room, but that through the complexity of the surfaces, you're almost always forced to imagine ceiling voids where ducts run, and in a situation like this one, where the visual was very important, also false floor, and computers were very important false floors, so that before you know it, in this section, about 40 or even in kind of extreme cases, 50% of the section is actually inaccessible to program and is simply there to support, let's say, the other 50%, and which is in a way an intolerable situation. Also, because in a section like this one, it would mean that you would have to, instead of a building of 100 meters, you would have a building of 200 meters in the worst case, where it really, that logic completely ridicules the concept out of existence. So then we thought with, and all these schemes have been done with with Cecil Beaumont of ARP. Then we thought of another, maybe more promising concept, where we took the floor, we divided it in narrow strips of 12 meters 50, which also coincided with the maximum area of fire compartments. And then we gave each of these floors, each of these walls, a certain thickness, so that we could run ducts through them, so that instead of having ducts through the ceiling, we had ducts in the walls. And because this width is kind of relatively limited, we could simply puncture the walls and have air coming out or air going in. So that that this concept, in a way, seemed to liberate us from the kind of obligation of making such a kind of ridiculous sandwich of the building. And because it was also a very, it seemed a convincing way of supporting at the same time the mass of the building and the voids, in the sense that the voids could simply be cut out of these concrete walls. And because of deep beam theory, the full 80 meters of this concrete wall would act as a beam and therefore allow the most bizarre and extreme perforations. So I will now show you the building kind of in a way floor by floor and go through it very quickly. This is the ground floor. We decided that or we felt that the Cinematheque and the movie part would be the most popular, so we had it in the lower parts, basically a series of large and small auditoriums, again carved out, which is the black part, carved out of the white of the store.